Ryan Hayes had 3 years to perfect the art of being invisible. 3 years of avoiding airports, avoiding questions, avoiding the word everyone whispered behind his back. But you can't hide at 35,000 feet when the captain's voice breaks through the cabin, panicked, desperate, asking if anyone can fly a Boeing 777 because both pilots are down. His 6-year-old daughter pressed against his shoulder, her small hand finding his, 187 passengers turning, searching, hoping. And Ryan Hayes, the man they would soon call a coward again, felt his chest tighten with the same suffocating fear that had destroyed him once before. The question wasn't whether he could fly the plane, it was whether he could face what flying it would cost him. The Boeing 777 had been in the air for 2 hours when Ryan Hayes decided he'd made a mistake. Not the mistake that had cost him everything 3 years ago, but the smaller kind, the kind where a man who hadn't flown since his license was revoked agreed to take his daughter across an ocean in a metal tube at 35,000 feet. The cabin lights were dimmed for the overnight flight to London, and most passengers around him had settled into that uncomfortable half-sleep that defined transatlantic travel. Ryan kept his eyes on the window, watching clouds drift past in the moonlight, refusing to look toward the cockpit door 20 rows ahead. Lily stirred against his shoulder, her small frame curled into the window seat. She'd wanted the window, had pressed her face against it during takeoff, with the pure wonder only a 6-year-old could manage. Now she slept with her favorite stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest, oblivious to the white-knuckled grip her father maintained on the armrest. Ryan forced his hand to relax, flexing fingers that had gone numb from tension. He'd taken half an anxiety pill before boarding, just enough to keep the worst thoughts at bay. Not enough to knock him out completely because he'd learned 3 years ago what happened when you weren't fully present, when you let your guard down, when you thought you were okay and discovered too late that you weren't. The flight attendant passed by with the drinks card, offering him a warm smile that he didn't return. She was young, maybe 25, with the practiced efficiency of someone still excited by the job. Her name tag read, Grace Miller. Ryan looked away before she could ask if he wanted anything. He didn't want to talk to anyone, didn't want to be noticed. The prescription bottle in his jacket pocket was a constant reminder of how far he'd fallen from the man he used to be. Captain Ryan Hayes, they'd called him. Senior pilot with 3,800 hours, a reputation for steady hands and sound judgment. Now he was just a mechanic who fixed cars instead of flying them, who took pills to get through the day, who couldn't even look at a cockpit without feeling his chest tighten. Lily had asked him about it once months ago when they'd driven past the regional airport near their apartment. "Daddy, you used to fly planes, right?" Her voice had been curious, innocent, without any understanding of the weight those words carried. Ryan had kept his eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel, because that was something he could control. "I did, baby," he'd said. But not anymore. She'd accepted it the way children accept things they don't fully understand, with a simple okay, before asking if they could stop for ice cream. He'd bought her 2 scoops that day, grateful for the simplicity of a question he knew how to answer. The turbulence hit without warning, just a gentle shudder, at first the kind any experienced traveler would ignore. But Ryan felt it in his bones, felt the slight shift in altitude as the plane adjusted and his breath caught in his throat. His hand found the armrest again, gripping hard enough that his knuckles went white. The overhead bin rattled softly. A woman across the aisle clutched her husband's hand. The plane steadied, and the moment passed, but Ryan's heart was still racing, his shirt damp with cold sweat. He closed his eyes and counted backward from 10, a technique his therapist had taught him for managing panic. By the time he reached 1, his breathing had almost returned to normal. Through the gap between seats, he could see the forward galley, where 2 flight attendants were preparing meal service. Beyond that, the cockpit door. Solid locked a barrier between passengers and the 2 people responsible for keeping everyone alive. Ryan knew what was behind that door. Knew every switch, every gauge, every procedure. could probably fly this plane blindfolded if he had to. But he also knew what happened when you weren't strong enough, when fear got inside you and locked your muscles and made you forget everything you'd ever learned, when you abandoned someone who needed you because you couldn't face your own weakness. Jake Morrison had been 26 years old, fresh-faced, eager, passionate about flying in a way that reminded Ryan of his younger self. Ryan had been assigned as Jake's check pilot for his final evaluation flight before full certification. It was supposed to be routine, a milk run from Boston to Chicago on a clear day. But halfway through the flight, the hydraulic system had failed. Not catastrophic, not immediately dangerous, but serious enough that Jake had tensed in his seat, his hands going rigid on the controls. Ryan had watched the kid handle it exactly as he'd been trained, calling out procedures, staying calm, doing everything right. And then the turbulence had hit. Ryan pressed his forehead against the cool window, trying to push away the memory. But it came anyway, the way it always did. The sudden drop in altitude, the alarms, Jake's voice rising just slightly asking if Ryan should take over. And Ryan had felt it then, that tightness in his chest, that crushing weight that made it impossible to breathe. Panic, pure and simple, flooding his system faster than he could fight it. He'd unbuckled his harness with shaking hands and stumbled to the galley, leaving Jake alone in that cockpit to land a damaged aircraft by himself. The kid had done it, had brought them down safely with a landing rough enough that 3 passengers suffered minor injuries, but everyone had walked away. Everyone except Jake's career, which had died the moment the investigation found that an experienced captain had abandoned his post. The announcement came over the speakers, suddenly jerking Ryan back to the present. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Grace Miller, your senior flight attendant." Her voice was steady, professional, but Ryan caught the undercurrent of stress. He'd heard that tone before, knew what it meant when crew tried to stay calm while delivering bad news. "We're experiencing a medical emergency in the cockpit. If there is anyone on board with commercial aviation piloting experience, we need you to identify yourself immediately by pressing your call button." The cabin erupted. Passengers sat up, looking around, whispering to each other. A man 3 rows up pressed his call button, standing halfway. "I've got my private pilot license," he called out. Grace appeared from the galley, moving quickly down the aisle. "Sir, I need commercial experience. Someone who can fly a Boeing 777. The man sat down, shaking his head. More whispers spreading like wildfire. Medical emergency. Cockpit. Both pilots. The words didn't need to be said aloud for everyone to understand what they meant. Ryan didn't move. Couldn't move. His hand was locked on the armrest again, and he could feel his pulse hammering in his neck. Lily had woken up confused by the commotion. "Daddy." Her voice was small, uncertain. "What's happening?" He looked down at her, at those wide eyes that trusted him completely, and felt something crack inside his chest. "Nothing, baby. It's okay. Go back to sleep." But she didn't sleep, just pressed closer to him, her rabbit squeezed tight. Grace was moving down the aisle now, her eyes scanning faces with growing desperation. She'd know, Ryan thought. They kept databases. She'd know exactly who he was if he raised his hand. Would know about the investigation, the revoked license, the headlines that had called him a coward. But she'd also know he had 3,800 hours. Know that he'd flown this exact aircraft model for 6 years. Know that he was, for better or worse, the most qualified person on this plane to do what needed doing. Their eyes met as she passed his row. Something in his face must have given him away, because she stopped, stared at him for a long moment while the cabin noise swirled around them. Ryan shook his head slowly, a tiny movement that said everything he couldn't speak aloud. "Please don't. Please let someone else. Please let me stay invisible." But Grace didn't move on. She leaned down, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Sir, do you have aviation experience?" Her eyes were searching his face, looking for something, finding it. "I need to know right now." Ryan's mouth was dry. He could feel Lily looking up at him, could feel every passenger in nearby rows starting to notice the exchange. His hands were shaking now, no way to hide it. His voice cracked, and he had to swallow hard before continuing. I can fly a 777. 4 words, 4 simple words that changed everything. Grace's expression shifted from desperate hope to something more complex. Recognition, maybe. Or fear. "What's your name?" she asked. Ryan closed his eyes. Hayes. Ryan Hayes. The silence that followed was brief but absolute. Then Grace straightened her professional mask, slipping back into place. "Come with me, Captain Hayes." Not a request, not a question, an order. Ryan didn't want to move, wanted to tell her about the panic attacks, about the frozen muscles, and stopped breath about how he'd failed when it mattered most. But Lily was looking at him with those trusting eyes, and behind Grace, the cockpit door stood open, and somewhere in the rational part of his brain that could still function, Ryan understood that everyone on this plane was about to die if he didn't stand up. He stood up. The walk to the forward galley felt longer than any flight Ryan had ever taken. Behind him, the whispers grew louder as passengers realized what was happening. Someone who'd been sitting near enough to hear his name pulled out a phone, frantically typing. Within seconds, the information would spread. Ryan Hayes, the pilot from the Boston incident, the one who'd abandoned his post, the coward who'd let a rookie land alone. He could feel their eyes on his back, could imagine what they were thinking. "This is who's going to save us. This is our only hope." Grace pulled him into the galley and lowered her voice. "Both pilots are unconscious. We think it's food poisoning from their pre-flight meal. We've got them on oxygen, but they're not responsive." She was speaking fast, efficiently, giving him facts the way crew were trained to do in emergencies. "We're 2 hours out from Iceland, closest diversion. Weather's bad. Winds at 40 knots, visibility down to 2 miles. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "I know who you are. I know what happened. But right now, you're all we've got." Ryan leaned against the galley wall, trying to force air into lungs that didn't want to cooperate. His vision was starting to narrow at the edges, the telltale sign of a panic attack building. Not now, he thought desperately. Not now. Please, not now. "I can't," he heard himself say. "I haven't flown in 3 years. My license is revoked. I'm not—" He stopped, because what could he say? "I'm not brave enough. I'm not strong enough. I'll freeze again. And everyone will die. Captain Hayes." Grace's hand was on his arm, firm and steady. "I've been flying for 20 years. I've seen good pilots and bad pilots. I watched the investigation footage from your incident. You know what I saw, a pilot with excellent skills who had a psychological crisis. Not a bad pilot. Not a dangerous one. Just a human being who hit his limit." She squeezed his arm. "Find your limit now. Because 187 people don't have any other choice." Behind them, a man's voice rose above the cabin noise. "That's Ryan Hayes, the pilot who abandoned the Boston flight. You're letting him fly us." Brett Sullivan, according to his loud complaints during boarding about overhead bin space. Middle-aged, expensive suit, the kind of man who thought volume equaled authority. "This is insane. He'll kill us all." Other voices joined in, some fearful, some angry. The cabin was descending into chaos, and Ryan could feel it pulling at him, dragging him down into the same spiral that had destroyed him 3 years ago. Then, Lily's voice cut through everything else. Small, clear, absolutely certain. "My daddy can fly anything." She'd followed him to the galley, was standing in the aisle with her rabbit tucked under one arm, looking up at him with complete faith. "You told me you were the best pilot ever. You said you could fly with your eyes closed if you had to." She reached up and took his hand. "Don't be scared, Daddy. I'm not scared. I know you can do it." Ryan looked down at his daughter, and felt something shift inside his chest, something that pushed back against the fear just a little, just enough. He thought about Jake Morrison, 26 years old, hands shaking on controls while Ryan had run. Thought about the 3 passengers who'd been injured in that rough landing because Jake had been alone when he shouldn't have been. Thought about what would happen to Lily if this plane went down because he was too afraid to try. The choice crystallized in that moment, simple and terrible. He could stay frozen and guarantee 187 deaths. Or he could walk through that cockpit door and face the thing that terrified him most. He knelt down and pulled Lily into a hug, holding her tight for just a moment. "Go sit with Miss Grace. Okay, Daddy has to work now." She nodded against his shoulder, then pulled back and looked at him seriously. "You can do this," she said, like it was just that simple. Like courage was a choice you made instead of something you either had or didn't. Ryan kissed her forehead, stood and looked at Grace. "Get me in there." The cockpit was worse than he'd expected. Both pilots were slumped in their seats, unconscious, but breathing with the help of portable oxygen. The autopilot was engaged, keeping the plane steady at cruise altitude, but the fuel gauge showed they were burning through reserves faster than calculated. The weather radar showed a mass of red and yellow over Iceland, and the communications panel was lit up with calls from air traffic control. Ryan slid into the captain's seat, and his hands found the controls with muscle memory that 3 years hadn't erased. The yoke felt familiar, solid, real, but his hands were shaking, and he could feel sweat sliding down his back. Grace helped drag the unconscious captain out of the seat, while another flight attendant did the same with the first officer. Then she climbed into the right seat, buckling herself in. "I'm not a pilot," she said, "but I can read a checklist and follow instructions." Ryan nodded, not trusting his voice. He keyed the radio. "Iceland Control. This is Transatlantic Flight 472. Emergency. Both pilots incapacitated. We have a passenger taking controls." The response came immediately. 472 confirmed passenger pilot qualifications. The controller's voice was tense but professional. Ryan took a breath. 3,800 hours, mostly on 777s. Type rated. Last flight was... He paused. 3 years ago. There was a longer pause on the other end. Then carefully, "Captain, can you confirm your name for our records?" Ryan closed his eyes. Hayes. Ryan Hayes. The silence that followed told him everything. The controller knew exactly who he was. Everyone in aviation knew about the Boston incident. But after a moment, the voice came back all business. "Understood, Captain Hayes. We're clearing you priority landing runway 19. Be advised winds are gusting to 45 knots, heavy crosswinds. Visibility 1.5 miles and snow. We'll vector you straight in." Ryan acknowledged, then began running through the overhead panel, checking systems, refreshing muscle memory. Beside him, Grace was reading through the approach checklist with steady concentration. The plane shuddered slightly as they hit some chop, and Ryan felt his chest tighten. Not now. Not yet. He had maybe 20 minutes before things got serious, before he'd have to actually land this aircraft in conditions that would challenge even a current pilot. His hands were still shaking on the yoke, and he could feel the panic trying to claw its way up his throat. The cockpit felt too small, too hot, too close. His vision was starting to narrow again, that tunnel effect that meant he was losing it. Jake's face flashed through his mind. 26 years old, terrified, alone, doing the impossible because Ryan hadn't been strong enough to help him. "Captain," Grace's voice cut through the spiral. "I need you to talk me through what you're doing, for the recording." She held up the cockpit voice recorder, but her eyes were steady on his face. She wasn't asking for the recording. She was asking him to focus, to ground himself in the technical details, to find his way back from the edge. Ryan forced himself to breathe, then began speaking, his voice rough but steady. "Checking fuel status. We've got enough for one approach, no second chances. Setting up for manual landing because the weather's too severe for autopilot below 1,000 feet." He walked her through each step, and with each word the panic receded just a fraction. This was something he knew, something he'd done thousands of times. The procedures were still there, buried under 3 years of fear and shame, but still there. His hands stopped shaking quite so badly. The tunnel vision eased back. Grace asked questions that kept him talking, kept him focused, kept him present. And slowly, minute by minute, Ryan felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Not confidence exactly, but competence, the muscle memory of a skill that had once defined him. 20 minutes later, they were beginning their descent. The plane was bucking now in the wind shear, and Ryan's hands were firm on the controls, feeling the aircraft respond. Iceland Control was talking him through the approach, giving wind updates, visibility reports. 472, you're cleared to land. Fire crews are standing by. Standard emergency procedure, but Ryan heard what they weren't saying. They were expecting him to crash, expected the coward pilot to fail again this time, with 187 lives, instead of just 3 injured passengers. Through the windscreen, Ryan could see the storm. Snow, whipping horizontally across the glass clouds so thick they might as well have been flying blind. The runway lights would appear out of that mess, with maybe seconds to react. And if his approach angle was off by even a degree or two, they'd either undershoot into the ocean or overshoot into the rough terrain beyond the airport. The engine warning light flickered on. Not a major problem yet, but something to watch. Everything that could go wrong was lining up to go wrong, just like Boston, just like 3 years ago. The radio crackled. Captain Hayes' weather's deteriorating. Recommend go around if you're not comfortable with the approach. They were giving him an out, a chance to fly another hour to their alternate, burn the rest of their fuel, try again somewhere else. The safe choice, the choice a scared pilot would make. Ryan looked at the fuel gauge and shook his head even though they couldn't see him. Negative control. Fuel state won't allow it. We're landing now or not at all. Copy that. A pause. Good luck, Captain. Ryan turned to Grace. Go back to the cabin. Make sure everyone's secured. Tell them. He stopped. What could he tell them that he hoped he wouldn't freeze this time? That he was sorry if he failed? Grace was already shaking her head. Not a chance. I'm staying. You need a first officer, and I'm what you've got. She picked up the checklist. Besides, someone needs to call out altitudes. Now tell me what you need me to do. The storm hit them at 5,000 feet. Wind shear that dropped the plane 200 feet in seconds, throwing them against their harnesses. Ryan fought the yoke, correcting keeping them on the glide path by pure instinct. Warning lights were flashing. Now engine 2 was losing power, probably ice in the intake. They were flying too heavy with too little power, in conditions that would have grounded most flights. Grace was calling out numbers, her voice remarkably steady. 3,000 feet. Airspeed 155. Localizer centered. Ryan's world narrowed to the instruments in front of him, to the feel of the yoke in his hands, to the sound of wind screaming past the cockpit. This was the moment. This was where he'd either prove he'd learned something from his failure or prove that he was exactly the coward everyone said he was. His chest was tight, but his hands were steady. The panic was there, lurking at the edges, but he kept it at bay by focusing on one thing at a time. Airspeed. Altitude. Heading. One thing. Then the next. Then the next. 2,000 feet. Grace's voice. Runway in sight. There through the snow. The double row of lights marking the runway threshold barely visible through the storm. Ryan adjusted course, fighting a crosswind that wanted to push them left. The plane shuddered and bucked, and somewhere in the cabin behind them people were probably screaming. But Ryan couldn't think about that, could only think about the runway rushing up at them too fast, the wind pushing them off course, the engine warning light that was now solid red. 1,000 feet, airspeed 160. Too fast. Ryan pulled back slightly on the throttles, felt the plane respond sluggishly with only one engine at full power. The runway was dead ahead now, but the crosswind was severe, pushing them into a crab angle that would tear the landing gear off if he touched down wrong. He'd have to wait until the last possible second, then kick the rudder hard, right to align with the runway. It was a maneuver that required perfect timing, perfect judgment, perfect execution. No margin for error. 500 feet. The ground rushed up. Ryan could see the runway markings, now could see the foam the fire crews had sprayed down in preparation for a rough landing. His hands were locked on the controls, every muscle in his body engaged in keeping this plane where it needed to be. The panic was trying to break through, trying to freeze him, but he pushed it down with everything he had. Not this time, not again. 200 feet. Too fast. Ryan knew, but there was nothing he could do about it now except ride it down. The runway lights flashed past on either side. He waited until the last possible moment, then kicked right rudder, hard feeling the plane swing to align with the center line. The wheels touched down with a jolt that rattled every rivet in the airframe. Too hard, but they were down. Ryan reversed thrust on the one good engine, applying brakes carefully to avoid skidding on the icy runway. The plane wanted to swerve left, pulled by the asymmetric thrust, and Ryan fought it with rudder and differential braking muscles straining. They were decelerating, but not fast enough. The runway end was coming up too quickly. Ryan pressed harder on the brakes, feeling the anti-skid system fighting him, and the plane slewed slightly right before straightening. 1,000 feet of runway remaining, then 500, then 200. The plane rolled to a stop with less than 100 feet to spare, and for a long moment, the only sound in the cockpit was the howl of wind and the steady ping of instruments. Ryan's hands wouldn't let go of the yoke. He sat there frozen now in a different way, unable to believe they were down, unable to believe he hadn't killed everyone. Grace was crying next to him, saying something he couldn't quite hear over the ringing in his ears. The radio was exploding with traffic control fire crews' emergency services. Ryan stared out the windscreen at the snow and slowly, carefully unclenched his fingers from the controls. Behind them, the cabin erupted in sound. Cheers, crying, prayers, the messy, complicated noise of 187 people realizing they were still alive. But Ryan couldn't move, could only sit in the captain's seat he'd abandoned 3 years ago and wonder if he'd actually done it, or if this was some dying dream. Grace reached over and squeezed his arm. "You did it," she said, her voice thick with tears. "Oh God, Ryan, you actually did it." The cockpit door burst open, and Lily was there running to him, despite regulations and common sense and everything else. Ryan unbuckled and caught her, pulling her into his lap and holding on like she was the only real thing in the world. She was crying, and he realized he was too, and for the first time in 3 years, the tightness in his chest wasn't panic. It was something else, something that felt almost like relief. The next several hours passed in a blur. Emergency crews got them off the plane and into the terminal. Paramedics checked the pilots who were starting to regain consciousness, but would need serious medical attention. Passengers were processed, statements were taken. Media had already descended on the airport cameras and reporters everywhere. Ryan heard himself giving answers to questions he didn't fully process. Saw his daughter being checked by medical staff, watched Grace give interview after interview about the passenger who'd saved them all. Brett Sullivan found him in the medical bay, where Ryan was sitting with a bottle of water he couldn't remember accepting. The businessman looked smaller than he had on the plane, humbled by proximity to death. "Captain Hayes." He extended his hand. "I was wrong about you. I'm sorry." Ryan shook it automatically, too numb to feel much of anything. "You weren't wrong," he heard himself say. "I am a coward. He paused, trying to find words. "I was more scared of losing my daughter than I was of being a coward again." Other passengers came by. Some thanked him. Some just looked at him with expressions he couldn't read. One woman, elderly, touched his arm as she passed. "My grandson wants to be a pilot," she said. "I'm going to tell him about today, about the man who was too scared to fly but did it anyway." Ryan nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Grace found him eventually, after most of the chaos had died down. She sat next to him in the empty gate area, where they'd been told to wait for the next available flight to London. Lily was asleep again this time, on a row of chairs with Ryan's jacket as a pillow. "The FAA is going to want to talk to you," Grace said quietly. "There'll be an investigation. But Captain Hayes," she paused, "you saved 187 lives today. That has to count for something." Ryan's phone buzzed. He'd turned it back on 20 minutes ago and had been ignoring the flood of messages and missed calls. But this one made him look. A text from an unknown number. He opened it. "I heard what you did. Saw it on the news. You showed up this time. That's something." "Jake." Ryan stared at the message for a long time. Not forgiveness, exactly. Jake wasn't ready for that, might never be ready. But acknowledgement. Recognition that Ryan had done what needed doing when it mattered. He typed back with shaking fingers. "I'm sorry. For everything." Then, after a moment, "Thank you for landing that plane 3 years ago. You were braver than I was." The response came quickly. "I'm not ready to talk. But maybe someday. Glad you found your courage. Better late than never." Ryan closed his eyes and leaned back in the uncomfortable airport chair. His whole body ached. His hands were still trembling slightly. The adrenaline crash was hitting hard, and he knew he'd probably need to talk to someone, probably need to adjust his medication, probably need a lot of things to process what had just happened. But right now, in this moment, he just felt tired. And maybe underneath the exhaustion, something that might eventually turn into peace. Grace stood up to leave, but paused. "For what it's worth, I've flown with a lot of pilots. Some brave, some not. The brave ones aren't the ones who never feel fear. They're the ones who feel it and fly anyway." She smiled slightly. "You flew today, Captain. Remember that." 6 months later, Ryan stood at a podium in front of a room full of pilots and aviation students. This wasn't his first talk, but it still made his stomach knot up every time. The organization that had invited him specialized in mental health support for pilots, helping those dealing with PTSD, anxiety, and other psychological challenges. Ryan had resisted. At first didn't think he had anything worth saying, but they'd persisted, and eventually he'd agreed. "I'm Ryan Hayes," he started, and watched recognition flicker across faces in the audience. "Some of you know that name, know what I did 3 years ago when I abandoned my post and left a 26-year-old pilot to land a damaged aircraft alone. Know that I was stripped of my license and my career because I wasn't mentally fit to fly." He paused, letting that sink in. "I'm not here to make excuses. What I did was wrong. It had consequences, and those consequences were deserved." He clicked to the next slide, showing a photo of the Iceland airport emergency vehicles surrounding a Boeing 777. "But 6 months ago I got a second chance. Not a chance to undo what I'd done. Not a chance to fix the career I destroyed, or take back the 3 years of therapy and medication and shame. Just a chance to choose differently when it mattered most." He told them the story, the emergency, the panic attack he'd fought through, the landing that had been as much luck as skill. "I was terrified every second. My hands shook. My vision narrowed. Everything in my body was screaming at me to run." A young woman in the front row was crying quietly. Ryan recognized the look on her face, the look of someone who understood exactly what he was talking about. "Here's what I learned," he continued. "Being brave doesn't mean you don't feel fear. It means you feel the fear, and you act anyway. It means you know your limits, but you push past them when lives depend on it. It means you accept that you're broken, but you show up anyway." After the talk, people came up to him. Some just wanted to shake his hand. Others wanted to share their own stories of fear, of failure, of finding their way back. The young woman from the front row waited until everyone else had gone, then approached hesitantly. "Captain Hayes, I had a panic attack during my solo flight last month. Failed my check ride. I've been thinking about quitting." She looked down. "But after hearing you, I think maybe I'll try again." Ryan thought about Jake Morrison, who'd texted him twice more in 6 months, brief messages, but communication nonetheless. Thought about Grace, who called sometimes just to check in. Thought about the 187 people whose lives had continued because he'd been terrified and done it anyway. "Try again," he told the young woman. "And when you're scared, and you will be scared, remember that fear is just information. It doesn't have to be a stop sign." His license had been reinstated with conditions. He could fly again, but only as an instructor, only with regular psychological evaluations, only with ongoing treatment. He'd accepted those terms without argument. Wasn't sure he wanted to fly commercially again anyway. But teaching other pilots, helping them understand what he'd learned the hard way about mental health and courage and fear that felt right. That felt like something he could do. Lily was 7 now, and sometimes Ryan took her to the small regional airport where he did his instructing. She'd sit in the office and do her homework while he taught students the basics of flight. Once she'd asked him if he missed being a captain. "I miss what I was before I made my mistake," he'd told her honestly. "But I don't miss being the person who ran away. I like being the person who came back." On the anniversary of the Iceland landing, Ryan drove out to the memorial for commercial aviation accidents. It was a quiet place, with plaques for various incidents, a place for families to remember. He wasn't looking for his own name. They didn't put memorials up for flights where everyone survived. He was looking for someone else. Found it on a newer plaque. Transatlantic Flight 847 Boston. 4 fatalities. Not his flight, but one that had happened 2 weeks after his incident. Pilot error, the investigation had said. Another crew that hadn't been strong enough when it mattered. Ryan stood there for a long time, thinking about how close they'd all come. 187 people who might have been names on a memorial if he'd frozen one more time, if fear had won one more time, if he'd chosen safety over courage one more time. He didn't have flowers, hadn't planned this stop. So he just stood with his hands in his pockets and said a quiet prayer for the 4 people who died because their pilot hadn't been able to save them. When he got back to his car, his phone showed a new message. Jake Morrison. "Hey, I'm going to be in town next week. You want to grab coffee?" No promises, but I think I'm ready to try talking. Ryan stared at the message. Coffee with Jake. The kid whose career he'd destroyed, whose life he'd derailed, who'd had every right to hate him forever. His hands were shaking slightly as he typed back. "Yes. Name the place and time. I'll be there." That evening, Lily asked him to help with a school assignment. They had to write about someone they considered a hero, and she'd chosen him. Ryan's immediate instinct was to deflect, to suggest she pick someone better, someone who hadn't spent 3 years as the industry's most famous coward. But she was insistent, so they sat together at the kitchen table while she wrote her essay in careful, rounded letters. "My dad is a hero because he was really scared, but he didn't let being scared stop him," she read aloud as she wrote. "He made a mistake before, and it was a bad mistake and it hurt someone. But when people needed him, he didn't run away again. He says being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about being scared and doing the right thing anyway. And that's what he did. So even though he's not a captain anymore, he's still my hero." Ryan had to leave the room for a minute. After that, had to stand in the bathroom, with his hands braced on the sink, and breathe through the wave of emotion. Not panic this time. Something else. Something that felt like grief and pride and shame all mixed together. When he came back, Lily was adding drawings to her essay, a stick figure version of an airplane, and 2 stick figures, one big and one small. Do you think it's good? She asked anxiously. Ryan pulled her into a hug. I think it's perfect, he said into her hair. Just like you. A week later, Ryan sat across from Jake Morrison in a coffee shop downtown. The kid wasn't really a kid anymore, 29, now teaching at a small flight school upstate. He looked older than he should, with lines around his eyes that spoke to sleepless nights and hard-won peace. They sat in awkward silence for a few minutes before Jake spoke. I've been angry at you for 3 years. Went to therapy, took medication, had to completely rebuild my life. He wasn't looking at Ryan, was staring at his coffee cup instead. Part of me still wants to hate you, wants to blame you for everything I lost. He paused. But I watched the footage of your landing, watched it a dozen times, and I realized something. Jake finally looked up. You were scared that day too, in Boston. You weren't drunk, weren't incompetent. You were just broken, in a way I didn't understand until it happened to me. He took a shaky breath. After that flight, I had nightmares, panic attacks, couldn't get back in a cockpit for 8 months, and I finally got it. Got what happened to you. Doesn't make it okay, doesn't excuse it, but I get it. Now. Ryan didn't try to defend himself. You shouldn't have had to go through that alone. You were my responsibility, and I failed you. I'm sorry doesn't cover it, but I am sorry. More than you'll ever know. They talked for 2 hours, carefully navigating around the deepest wounds, finding small pieces of common ground. It wasn't forgiveness, not completely, but it was a start. A recognition that they were both just humans who'd been broken and were trying to figure out how to be whole again. As they stood to leave, Jake hesitated, then held out his hand. I'm not ready to be friends. Maybe I never will be. But I think I'm ready to stop being your enemy. Ryan shook his hand, feeling the weight of 3 years of guilt shift slightly. Not gone, never gone, but maybe finally bearable. The story didn't have a perfect ending because life doesn't work that way. Ryan still had panic attacks sometimes, still had to adjust his medication, still woke up some nights in a cold sweat dreaming about cockpits and frozen muscles and people counting on him to be strong. Jake would probably carry his own scars forever, would probably never fully trust anyone in a cockpit again. 187 people had lived, but they'd still been traumatized by coming so close to death. But Ryan had learned something in that storm over Iceland, something his therapist had been trying to teach him for 3 years. Courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was fear acknowledged. Fear faced. Fear pushed through when it mattered most. He'd been a coward once, and he'd probably be scared many more times in his life. But he'd also proven when it counted that being scared didn't mean staying frozen, that being broken didn't mean being useless, that failing once didn't mean failing forever. He kept a photo on his desk at the flight school. It showed Lily standing next to a small Cessna wearing an aviation headset that was too big for her and grinning at the camera. She'd asked if she could learn to fly when she turned 10. Ryan had said yes, had promised to teach her himself, would teach her about weather and instruments and procedures, but more importantly, would teach her about fear, about failure, about the choice you make when everything in you wants to run, but running isn't an option. Because Ryan Hayes had been just an ordinary passenger in seat 8A until he wasn't. Had been a coward until the moment he chose not to be. And while he couldn't erase the past, couldn't give Jake back those 3 lost years, couldn't undo the panic attack that had started everything he could live with, what came after, could wake up each day and choose courage over comfort, action over paralysis, showing up over running away. It wasn't redemption exactly. Redemption implied you'd earned forgiveness, and Ryan knew he hadn't. But it was something. It was 187 lives that continued. It was a daughter who still believed in him. It was a former junior pilot who'd texted, "Thank you for trying," after their coffee meeting. It was students who learned from his mistakes. It was standing in a cockpit simulator, hands on controls, breathing through the fear instead of running from it. It was enough. Not perfect. Not complete. Not the ending he would have written 3 years ago when he'd still thought he was invincible. But real. Human. Honest. And on the days when the panic threatened to overwhelm him again, when the shame felt too heavy to carry. Ryan thought about that storm over Iceland and reminded himself of something true. He'd been terrified, and he'd flown anyway. And maybe, in the end, that was the only kind of courage that really mattered.